This lecture podcast will help to explain what we are doing in Theme 1, the Great Convergence, and it will explore the significance of the Great Convergence in the larger context of human history. We can begin by asking the question, what is the Great Convergence? Three key features come to mind. First, the Great Convergence began with the reconnection of all of humanity following the oceanic explorations and conquests of the Portuguese and Spanish since the 15th century. Now, people crossing oceans began long ago. People have shown a remarkable ability to cross vast bodies of water, even in times before we think that there was advanced navigational technology or anything like that. Somehow, people made it to Australia, for example, even though it was never fully connected by land to earlier land masses. And even in more recent times, we see people developing the seagoing technology to crisscross the Indian Ocean, for example, the South China Sea. So people had been taking to the ocean for a very long time. It's just they had never fully connected all of the major bodies of water around the world until the 15th century. And once this was accomplished, the isolation of Africa-Eurasia from the Americas was finally broken. The Portuguese and Spanish were able to do this because they extended older knowledge and technology and understanding of oceanic exploration to areas where there had not been extensive oceanic exploration. They entered into areas where very few, if any, ocean-going societies were really operating or had ever been. The big exception, of course, was the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. But by the time that they got there, the major competitive presence that would have come from China had been removed already. Another key factor is that the Portuguese especially had extensive experience in dealing with the Mediterranean and in the Eastern Atlantic in an earlier era. And that's where they were able to practice in many ways the things that they would eventually export further into Africa as well as into the Americas. And the Spanish were the same. And in fact, the people who were typically the mariners for the Portuguese and the Spanish were not necessarily from Portugal or Spain, but were part of these larger navigational cultures that we find throughout the Mediterranean. Perfect example being Christopher Columbus, who was Italian. The second feature is that the Great Convergence resulted in accelerated and amplified movements of people over great distances. The first was the presence of Western Europeans in new places. This was in Africa, Asia, as well as the Americas. Now, Western Europeans, and Europeans in general, had been traveling to other regions in earlier times, but this now included people from areas that were further west or more on the fringes of Europe. And now they were entering into areas that few Europeans had been. For the most part, Europeans had not been to Africa south of the Sahara, and they had not been to the Americas. I mean, there was some contact with the upper regions of North America with Vikings and some others, but for the most part, Western Europeans had very little or absolutely no contact with the people of the Americas. Another mass movement of people included enslaved Africans. Now, enslaved Africans comprised 3/4 of all the newcomers from the Old World to the Americas before 1800. People usually don't think about that. They tend to think because these were European empires in the Americas that most of the people who came across the Atlantic were Europeans. This was more so the case in British North America, but for the most part throughout Latin America, whether it was Spanish or Portuguese or even the French territories, the vast majority of the newcomers were Africans. And that situation changed in the 1800s when larger numbers of Europeans began immigrating to the Americas, and they went everywhere from Canada all the way south into the lower reaches of South America. So that was a phenomenon that occurred then, but before that time, the newcomers were largely Africans. Now, all of these movements over multiple centuries eventually transformed the Americas from a land of the indigenous people, the Amerindians or Native Americans, to being a land of African and European newcomers. The third feature of the Great Convergence included the formation of new cultural expressions stimulated by new or increased contact and competition between societies. Probably the most notable outcome of this process was the formation of new syncretic cultural forms created from African, European, and Amerindian cultures. Now, syncretic is a term that's used in the study of culture that talks about a blending process. It's not a very precise term, but it shows up in the textbook, and I'll probably mention it here and there as we go through other lectures later on. And what we also see, just beyond the new syncretic cultural forms, especially within the realm of religion, are these new ways of understanding what we could call old religions. For example, Christianity. Christianity goes through a remarkable transformation. First, it becomes global. It was largely isolated, at least the Western forms of Christianity were isolated within Europe. But with these conquests and explorations, Christianity went along with it and became present in the Americas and Africa and Asia. Another new interesting development that came about relative to this old religion of Christianity was the formation of Protestant Christianity. That was within Europe itself, but that too was then transplanted and transformed into other parts of the world when Protestant Christians became explorers and conquerors. We also see another transformation of an old religion, this case Islam, within the context of the interactions between the Safavids and the Ottomans. And this was a competition basically between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. This is a new development because as these two states became increasingly powerful, it was as though their forms of religion became national religions within Islam, and it set up a new dynamic of competition. Another realm of new cultural expressions that came about because of the Great Convergence was the spread of European languages into new territories, but especially a language such as Portuguese, which became a lingua franca. It became a common language between cultures over vast distances. And nobody, or very few people, spoke it as a first language. But if you were going to deal with oceanic trade, it was one of the languages that you learned. And so Portuguese, for example, becomes a language of the ocean. And finally, we see the formation of a new awareness of the larger world because there were all these new things in this new world, and that then stimulated new knowledge. This is in the realms of science and philosophy and theology, and these reflected an evolving worldview because the world was getting bigger. This was especially the case for Europeans, but we also see this happening in the knowledge systems of the societies that had contact with the Europeans too. So there were transformations in knowledge going on all over the place. Now, when talking about the Great Convergence, we can get a bit too focused on the new stuff that resulted from it. But to understand its full significance, we need to look at it within the larger context of human history. So we need to think about what came before the Great Convergence. Before the Great Convergence, much of human history consisted of the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence was the spread of humanity from Africa throughout the world beginning around 80,000 years ago to 100,000 years ago. Now, the divergence began within Africa during our first 100,000 years, but it became even more pronounced once a small segment of our African ancestors left. The process of movement into new lands has continued ever since then, and the Great Convergence should be seen as a continuation of something that we have always done. Let's look at this process by interpreting some maps. Now, the first thing we need to understand about the Great Divergence is that all of humanity has African origins. For the first 100,000 years of human history, our ancestors lived only in Africa. They were first in Eastern and Southern Africa, and then they moved around within Africa long before any of them left to settle outside of Africa. This tells us a couple things. First, it suggests that movement is inherent in who we are. Indeed, we lived as gatherers and hunters for more than 95% of our history until the development of agriculture. Now, this required us to be mobile to exploit variations in food resources, and this meant that the necessity and ability to move shaped our earliest cultural institutions. Further, the settlement of our African ancestors into different environments of Africa helped to create the cultural knowledge that would prove essential to living in new environments outside of Africa. The fact is, our ancestors were smart to begin with, and that intelligence allowed for the Great Divergence to happen and to succeed throughout the world. When that time came, around 100,000 years ago or a little later, we ventured out into southern Eurasia first and spread from there. Although we were once connected, our vast spread ultimately led to a significant disconnect between those of us who remained in Africa, Eurasia, and those of us who settled in the Americas. It's interesting that our knowledge and technology allowed us to get to new places, but that didn't allow us to remain connected between Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas. This is a really interesting question, trying to figure out why that was. I mean, if it's possible for people to cross water, if it's possible for people to make long, difficult overland journeys, it just seems strange that people did not rely on the same knowledge and abilities to maintain contact. In the end, this created a separation of two realms, and I represent them here by the boxes that you see on the map. With this box, you see a green one, which surrounds Africa, Eurasia, and you see kind of a yellow or orangish one that surrounds the Americas. Now, within these boxes, there's a lot of interaction. There's continued divergence, movement of people, but then there's also the process of convergence, where people are establishing new contacts with each other within those regions. Now, in Africa, Eurasia, those divergences and convergences were very common. But within the Americas, the extent of movement and convergence was not nearly the same as in Africa, Eurasia. It was a little less intense, even though it had its consequences, but it wasn't quite of the same nature. Now, this separation then created conditions in the Americas that would have huge consequences once the separation was bridged. We see that especially with certain forms of technology, but most importantly with the development of disease and resistance to certain disease. That's a theme that's addressed extensively in the textbook as well as in some of the other learning media, so I won't address it extensively here. By linking Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas through oceanic travel, Western Europeans ended the effective separation of Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas. Now, this was not limited to the Atlantic. It included the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And others had, as I mentioned before, others had been traversing these waters in earlier times, but they weren't linking them to each other. There weren't extensive links between the Indian Ocean and the greater Pacific Ocean, and there certainly weren't connections between the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and the Atlantic. So this is what Western Europeans introduced to the larger dynamic of oceanic navigation. The key thing to understand is that even though the Indian Ocean and the Pacific are important within this connective process, it's the Atlantic connection that was fundamental. This was the hardest to achieve, and it linked people who had relatively little contact with one another before this time. Now, the point of connecting people from regions that rarely had contact or had no contact in earlier times is best seen in this image. Within this image, we see European, African, and Amerindian men. The people from Southern Europe and North Africa comprised the Mediterranean world, and there was lots of interaction and blending culturally, biologically, so much so that it's hard to create formal demarcations between Africa and Europe, really, and even Western Asia within this Mediterranean world. It is its own place. But in this picture, we see some folks from Africa and Europe that did not necessarily come from societies that had extensive contact with each other in earlier times. We see Western European men, in this case Spanish men, with an African man. Now, this African man probably came from Western or Central Africa, or at least his parents did. There were Africans in Spain during this time, but they were relatively recent arrivals. So in this case, you see those two groups of people interacting, but none of these Europeans or Africans had any known historical connections with indigenous groups in the Americas. Of course, they all shared distant ancestry, but those contacts were at best 45,000 years old, if not older. Now, within a very short period of time, we see that these different branches of our family tree that were once long separated were now entwined in ways that transformed the lives of people then and our entire world since then. And this is why the Great Convergence matters. From this understanding, we can look at a few more aspects of our world today that can be attributed directly to the Great Convergence. First, the political organization of our world owes a great deal to the European empires that were first formed within the Great Convergence. We start off with the Portuguese and the Spanish. They connected lands from the Americas into Africa and into Asia and the Pacific region, and began this process of redefining the political geography of the world as they were creating these larger global connections. A little later on, we see the English join in and the French as well. The English primarily in forming their own empire, which was the British Empire. And there were a few others too, the Dutch and the Germans to some extent, but not nearly as much as the Portuguese and Spanish and then the English and French. Now, the modern nations formed from these old empires still retain some of the affinity based on language and culture to these earlier groupings. And many of the political alliances that are still operational are based upon the older imperial associations. Second, the population geography of our world also has been fundamentally altered by the Great Convergence. Probably the first indication of this is the spread of Europeans. They basically took over lands of indigenous peoples in the Americas and Australias, thus transforming those lands fundamentally. And second, we see the spread of Africans into new lands as well. That went along with the spread of Europeans because, of course, Europeans at this time were practicing race-based slavery in pretty much all of their colonial possessions. And so we see then that Africans are also part of this process, being taken to new areas and leading to the demographic transformations of those areas, especially the Americas. The third thing that we see in this larger population geography is the decline and displacement of Amerindian populations. Now, there's a popular mythology that these populations were wiped out or they disappeared. In some areas, this was the case, but by and large, that didn't happen. They did not disappear. In fact, we see large Indian populations in Latin America. We also see some areas where there are significant indigenous populations in the U.S. and Canada. But for the most part, if you look throughout Latin America, you see a lot of representation of indigenous people. Nevertheless, those populations would be much larger if the earlier demographic disasters due to disease and the displacement of indigenous people had not occurred. Finally, the transformations in population geography due to the Great Convergence relates to the emergence or the creation of so-called mixed populations in these contact zones. This is something that we see extensively in the Americas, the formation of groups of mestizos and all the different castas that is referenced within the textbook in chapter 13. You get an extensive exploration of this process. In many ways, these are new people because they're blendings, you could say, of older populations, of Europeans, Africans, and Amerindians. And in many places throughout the Americas, this is the dominant demographic, or people who have mixed ancestry. Next, we move on to the use and geography of languages in our world. Two of the three most spoken languages in the world today gain speakers through the Great Convergence and its consequences. Those two are Spanish and English. When we are looking at a list of what first languages are spoken throughout the world, and the first language is the language you were raised with. It's the first language that you acquire and use in your life. Spanish is number 2, and English is number 3. Number 1 includes Chinese languages, most importantly Mandarin, but Spanish and English are number 2. Portuguese, which we also associate with the Great Convergence, is number 6 as a first language, and French is number 16 as a first language. Now, what's interesting about this is that these European languages are spoken in a wider range of nations than are the other more popular first languages. Like Hindi and Arabic are very high on the list, but they are spoken in fewer countries than are Spanish, English, Portuguese, and French. Now, that range of countries where people speak these European languages is a result of the Great Convergence and the empires that they created. And we will revisit this issue of language and the Great Convergence very soon. But for now, we'll move on to the next one. The Great Convergence had a significant influence on the practice and geography of religion in our world. As mentioned earlier, and as you see in the textbook readings, the globalization of Christianity is one of the major products of this process. People who count the number of followers of different religions in the world put Christianity as number 1 in the list. This is a kind of a difficult issue because most religions don't really count followers, but especially since the 1800s and in the 20th century, with a lot of missionary efforts, a lot of the different Christian groups have been very assiduous about counting people who've converted and followers and all that. So the list may be a little skewed, but it's definitely the case that a large segment of the human population identify with Christianity, and of all the religions that have followers throughout the world, Christianity seems to be the most widely distributed throughout the world, with significant numbers of followers, not only in Europe, but especially in the Americas and in Africa. In fact, most of the followers of Christianity live in societies outside of Europe and the United States. So the globalization of Christianity is really at the heart of these changes from the Great Convergence. But there's also an impact on Islam. I mentioned briefly a little bit about stuff that was going on between Sunni and Shia with the Ottomans and the Safavids, but another neglected aspect of the presence of Islam throughout the world is the role of African Muslims. Many of the Africans who were enslaved from Western Africa were Muslims, and they brought that with them to the Americas, from Brazil, the United States, all throughout the Americas. You see this African Islamic influence. Now, that didn't last for a very long time because most of the Africans who were brought were not Muslim, but it was there. And it continued to have an influence even in later times. Well, the growth and expansion of Christianity and Islam also had the impact in diminishing the public presence of older religions that existed in societies where Christianity and Islam expanded, what we might call traditional religions, I guess you could say. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is that even where Christianity and Islam expanded into the Americas or wherever else, Africa or Asia, usually it didn't mean the end of the older religious practices. Oftentimes there was a coexistence or a blending. This is something that we're going to talk about in another lecture podcast, so I'll just save the details of that for later. Next in our list is the development of new bodies of knowledge in our world. This really focuses on the emergence of what we call the scientific revolution in Europe in the 16th century. Now, this owed a great deal to the wealth of new information derived from the new people and places encountered by Europeans during the Great Convergence. And as they encountered all this new stuff, they were coming up with new ways to understand the world on so many levels, on a physical level, in also extending that into philosophy and even religion with the development of new theologies. But beyond the scientific knowledge, beyond the impact on religion that I described before, another thing that we don't quite associate with this, though, is something that had a much bigger influence once we get into the 1700s and after, and that's the development of new political philosophies. Many of these we take for granted today, such as the modern forms of democracy, representative government, the concept of national sovereignty, or the legal concept of freedom for individuals. These were developed in the context of expansion, empire, and enslavement that accompanied the Great Convergence. This was no coincidence. The world created by the Great Convergence posed fundamental questions about how people should live together and who should be in charge of society and the state. And so we see these new political philosophies come out of that struggle to answer those questions. There's so much more related to almost all aspects of daily life, but we will have to save some of that until later. For now, let's take a closer look at language and religion and the Great Convergence. This is my favorite representation of the languages of the world in graphic form. If you look closely, you see that the name of a language family, not an individual language, but the language family, gets its own color and placement on the map where that language family predominates. Throughout most of Africa, Eurasia, these were the dominant language families already, so that didn't change. The two key exceptions are in Southern Africa and Australia, where Afrikaans and English, both belonging to the Germanic language family, became dominant. The Americas present a very different story. The Germanic language family predominates in North America in the form of English. The Romance language family predominates in Latin America in the forms of Spanish and Portuguese. Interspersed between the Germanic and Romance areas are many patches of, quote, American Indian languages. That's how they're labeled here. These include the languages of those descended from the original inhabitants. Before the Great Convergence, all people in the Americas spoke American Indian languages. The one thing that's not readily conveyed in this beautiful map is the presence of additional languages that people acquire and use throughout the world. If this map had a layer for that, we would see Germanic appear on top of Indo-Aryan in the region of India, or Romance on top of Bantu in Central Africa, as the colonial languages of Britain and France became added languages for people there, and even official languages of new independent nations formed in the 20th century. Indeed, most people in most of the world have been multilingual. So it is important to keep in mind that the spread of European languages because of the Great Convergence has not entailed the demise of local languages. That has happened in some cases, and many languages of small minority groups continue to die out every day in our times. But again, most people have been multilingual, so the cultural consequences of the Great Convergence can become very complicated once we scratch the surface. Religion is very similar to language in this regard. We see a similar pattern in that the religious geography of Africa Eurasia today is not too much different than what it was before the Great Convergence. The exceptions to this are the Protestant Christian areas of Europe, Southern Africa and Australia, and the so-called tribal and Christian areas in Western, Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. Now, tribal is just a cop-out term here. As a historian, I specialize in the interaction between these so-called tribal religions and Christianity, so I'm not too happy about this lazy way to talk about religious cultures. I will address this issue more in the Religious Revolutions Lecture podcast. Now, the key difference between the pre-Great Convergence map and this map of our world today is the presence of Roman Catholic and Protestant Christianity in the Americas. This is just like we saw with the Germanic and Romance language families in the Americas. But just like that example, we know that people in the Americas, especially those of Amerindian descent and people of African descent, have always maintained the traditional religions of the Americas and of Africa while also embracing Christianity. So the religious cultures of the Americas have been and continued to be layered with multiple religions coexisting in most places and even within most people at the same time. Another difference that we cannot fail to note here is the Shia portion of the Islamic world. Although the divide between the Shia and Sunni forms of Islam is very old, the current predominance of Shia Islam in Iran and parts of Iraq, which is not shown on this map for some reason, developed over many generations since the 1500s because of the political and religious conflicts between the Ottomans and the Safavids and the rise of Wahhabi Islam. We can attribute this to aspects of the Great Convergence, as the growth of the Ottoman Empire was integral to European participation in the Great Convergence, and the rise of Islamic revivalism had strong ties to resistance to European imperialism. Now, of course, there were many internal factors not connected to the Great Convergence, but by this time in world history, nothing that happened in major states such as the Ottoman Empire or the Safavid state occurred in isolation from the developing global dynamics amplified by the Great Convergence. Indeed, the influence and impact of the Great Convergence resonated throughout the world. Sometimes it took a long time, but it eventually touched pretty much everybody within the world at some point or another. Well, this is just a first taste of the Great Convergence and its role in shaping our world. We will explore more in the next lecture podcast in this theme, as well as in later lectures and reading assignments.